Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Encore episode of the Psychology Talk podcast. Welcome to the Psychology Talk podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Scott Hoy. The Psychology Talk podcast is a unique conversation about psychology from around the globe. We bring you ideas from mental health practitioners and experts to keep you informed about the latest issues and trends. Topics include developments and research in psychotherapy and social sciences, hypnosis and mind-body treatments, meditation and spirituality, and new treatment modalities. And while you're listening, please take a moment to subscribe and give us a review at your favorite streaming site. It helps us to grow and further reach people with quality programming. And now, here's the episode. Hello and welcome to the Psychology Talk podcast. I'm Dr. Scott Hoy. Today my guest is Rebecca Hendrix. Rebecca is a Manhattan-based licensed marriage and family therapist. She has advanced training in therapeutic psychedelic integration. She completed training through MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, to provide MDMA-assisted psychotherapy when it becomes legal in most states. She currently offers ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. She has presented to lay audiences on psychedelic medicines to increase awareness and understanding of these therapies for consumers. And she will do so for us today. Rebecca, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Scott. I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah, we are too. Well, tell us a little bit about yourself and your experience. I mean, basically with MAPS. Maybe you can talk a bit about the training that you got and what you do.
Sure. Okay. Well, let's see. I can start with the fact that I'm a therapist on the ground in this emerging part of science, just trying to get as much training as possible because I believe that eventually they will become available. I think the results are so great that it's going to start to look bad if they're not legalized. I'm a holistic integrative psychotherapist with a background in spiritual psychology, which basically means I adhere to a theory that we're all spiritual beings here having a human experience and that we're here to grow and learn, and that we draw people, places, and things into our awareness in order to grow and learn. I have a passion for getting these medicines out there in a legal way because I believe in their ability to heal those suffering. Mainly, especially right now, actually, because of the mass PTSD that I think is occurring due to the pandemic and everything from frontline people, frontline responders, nurses, doctors, people that have lost loved ones. I think that we don't even know and probably won't be able to measure for some time what that has done to everybody. And there's a need to make sense of what's happened in the last couple of years and how it affected us all and to heal. And I think that psychedelics present an innovative option to do that, in addition to what regular psychopharmacology offers.
Yeah, I would agree. The literature looks very promising. I was privy to Johns Hopkins, Michael Pollan and MAPS presentation at APA in 2019. It was an all-day feature on their main stage, plus some side presentations. So yeah, it looks very exciting. What can you say a little bit about maybe your training at MAPS? Like what was that like for you? And feel free to plug MAPS as much as you like.
Okay. So MAPS is the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. For anybody that might not know that, it started by a guy named Rick Doblin in 1986. And he became really passionate about MDMA and has pretty much spent his life trying to get it approved by the FDA. It was 30 years from his start to actually when MDMA got breakthrough status. And he has done this all through raising money in the private sector. And it's one of the first times, other than when RU 486 was brought into existence by a nonprofit, that a nonprofit is trying to bring a drug into becoming licensed. And so he recently made MAPS as the 100% owner of the MAPS Public Benefit Corporation, to be able to market drugs to maximize public benefit, not for profit. So it's really quite an amazing organization that has a lot of really big supporters like Dr. Bronner's and Peter Thiel and people all over the map. But they focused in on MDMA because PTSD is such a huge thing in our country. 18 veterans every day, suicide, and we haven't really had any new developments in the past 20 years for PTSD. So they focused in on MDMA, and MDMA was first synthesized in 1912. It was introduced as a street drug in the 60s and the 70s. It was found in different street samples in 10 different states. And in the 80s, it spread across the U.S. in recreational use. But in 1985, it was scheduled under the Controlled Substances Act and banned. So what's different about MDMA and interesting is that it doesn't usually produce the visions and the hallucinations or the altered perceptions of reality that's typical in the other classic psychedelics, but it does seem to consistently induce positive effect and reduce or lessen anxiety in contrast to the other psychedelics. And it seems to be a superior tool to even ketamine for PTSD. So I became very kind of indoctrinated in their model and their protocol in their training. And I'll share a little bit about that.
Please do.
So after a careful screening, patients signed a very detailed informed consent. And then they have 3 90-minute prep sessions. And a prep session is when you're typically kind of forming an alliance with the patient, understanding their history, going over the logistics. Sometimes people say it's kind of like flight instructions for your journey, things like helping people to understand that there's a necessity to surrender, not resist what may come up during your dosing day. There's often tension that happens in fighting against losing a sense of ourself that creates anxiety. So what's really interesting about the MDMA and the training is that they believe that the basic premise of the approach is that the therapeutic effect is a result of our inner healing intelligence, as well as the effects of MDMA. So the inner healing intelligence is something that was originally started by Jung or Stan Grof and any other traditions which honor our innate ability to heal. One of the main co-therapists and doctors on the MDMA trials is a doctor named Dr. Michael Midhofer. He and his wife Annie do a lot of the trials. And I heard him once say that as an ER physician, which he used to be, if somebody would come into the emergency room with like a big gash in their arm, like 5-centimeter gash, he would provide the favorable conditions to healing. So he'd get out any gravel, things like that. But he wouldn't actually heal the wound. The patient would come back in a couple of weeks and the wound would then be 2 centimeters instead of 5 centimeters. And it's the patient that, because our bodies have an innate ability to heal, but we also believe that our psyches have that innate ability to heal. And the MDMA helps us to get in touch with that innate ability to heal. And the PTSD is kind of like the gravel that gets in the way. So the MDMA provides the favorable conditions to heal.
Okay. So, and what about it does that? I mean, you mentioned saying like affect or changes to a more positive stance, probably a less reactive, probably less of a fight or flight response during the PTSD, I guess, and you can kind of look at the material. The episodic memories can be kind of integrated into something that's not so scary. Is that kind of what it does? Does it kind of drive a wedge between reactance and the memory?
Yes, in essence. I mean, people with PTSD, they have, it's kind of like their amygdala it's our internal fire alarm. So people with PTSD, Their fire alarm tends to go off all the time, and they don't even know when it's going to go off. Where yours or mine, if we don't have PTSD, will only go off essentially when there's a fire. So people with PTSD have persistent negative thoughts, fear. They tend to avoid triggers. They have numbness. And the treatments that we currently have can be hard to tolerate. Sometimes only 40 to 60%. 40 to 60% still report symptoms and still meet the criteria after having the treatments that we currently have. But when they're given MDMA, the fear response goes down, and because it increases serotonin, it increases dopamine, and it increases norepinephrine. And so what happens is that the patients start to experience more empathy, pro-social behavior, increases feelings of intimacy and closeness to others. It reduces fear when confronting threatening material, and it allows the patient to revisit the trauma without a feeling of being overwhelmed by terror or shame. So it puts them into this, what they call like a PTSD optimal arousal zone with a window of tolerance, which means they're alert, but they're not scared to talk about or feel the challenging feelings. So it enhances connection, reduces fear, and helps to overcome this kind of emotional numbing so that they can experience the full range of emotions and not be overwhelmed.
Okay. So it gives them a chance to not be overwhelmed. So maybe you could say from theory of mind, they develop more of a metacognition or perspective, right? They're able to kind of mentalize about their experience because it's not so intense.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Wow.
It takes those primary, like the fear and the terror away so that they can actually unpack it, talk about it, and move through it. And, even though there's amazing results that are coming out of this, it's also good to just note that it's not always an easy process. I mean, these dosing days, they're 8 hours, and people could sometimes cry for a few of those hours, rage for an hour. But what's special about it is the emphasis on the psychotherapy, where you have two trained therapists on either side of you to guide you, to hold your hand if desired, if consented, that have a great deal of confidence in the medicine to help you move through and kind of go into any of the fears. Mm-hmm. But what's very different about it than, I guess, traditional therapy is that because of this emphasis on the inner healing intelligence, the therapist, any intervention that the therapist does is only going to be what is in service to what is already coming up for the patient. So even if I maybe have worked with this patient and know of a big rupture that they had with, say, their father growing up, if what comes up during their MDMA session is a big hurt that happened when they were 10 years old and didn't make the football team, then I help them to focus on what's coming up, not what I may think would be good for them to focus on. So I found that to be very different than traditional therapy.
You're not trying to interpret anything. You're not trying to say, well, it's probably, this was just a reminder to the actual precursor of all this, which was that rupture with your dad, and that just played out. You're not trying to interpret. You're just holding the space while they have the realizations themselves. It sounds like more of
exactly. There's a belief that there's a belief that the medicine takes you where you need to go. So where traditional therapy could come more into the scene is during the integration sessions that happen afterwards. Mm-hmm. So the day after the 8-hour dosing day, there's 3 90-minute integration sessions that happen weekly before your next dosage. And during that time, we may unpack all of the things, all of the awarenesses, insights, challenging moments that came up during the actual dosing. And then that's when you can sometimes bring your own therapy model into it. There's a number of therapy models that complement very nicely psychotherapeutic work using psychedelics, which are somatics, IFS, internal family system parts work, breath work. So it's more common in the integration sessions to more deeply unpack these.
So you're basically containing everything in a holding environment during those sessions and letting the medicine do the medicines do their thing, do the healing or assist in the healing when that's actually happening. I'm curious, how many sessions typically do MDMA MDMA treatment for PTSD typically? Is it 15 sessions? I think in psilocybin it's 8 to 15 sessions, right? And there's two or three dosage days.
Yes, there's 2 or 3 doses. There's 3 dosage days. The protocol that they're using in the clinical trial is 3 prep sessions, 3 8-hour dosing days, and then after each of the dosing days, there are 3 90-minute integration sessions. So
14 sessions. It sounds like, yeah.
Yeah, it's quite lengthy and intense and demanding on the patient and the therapist.
And so this, like, for those in the audience who want to do Molly and try to get the same effect on their own, probably isn't going to have anything anywhere quite like what they might be looking for. Although I've had patients say that they've taken certain psychedelics or pseudo-psychedelics and had some effect with PTSD on their own, but that, that's probably circumstantial and maybe not based on any kind of studies. What is the dosage? Is it kind of like psilocybin, which is so many micrograms per kilogram of body weight? Is the dosage in MDMA similar, or is it different?
I believe it's similar. I believe that it's similar, that they do it by your body weight, but that's not my area of expertise, but I do believe that it is similar, but the doctor decides which dose that you will have.
And the 2 people available for the therapy, is it typically a male and a female identified individual as a therapist?
Typically a male-female team, yes. When people go into these states, they're altered, and an altered state is a vulnerable state. Mm-hmm. And so, and especially with MDMA, it can increase, it's an empathogen and an entactogen, meaning it touches us within, and we also have a lot of empathy. And so they found it early on that just to make the patients feel safe, it's good to have 2 therapists in the room. I mean, so many people that have had PTSD have trust issues, and they need to feel as safe as possible to be able to go as deep as possible with this medication. So having 2 therapists in the room makes them feel safe and is a safe thing to do.
Are there any contraindications for who should be taking MDMA versus who should not be getting this therapy?
Well, there are certain risks involved, and that's during a screening is when the doctor will assess for these risks. Certainly, I mean, in the clinical trials, they're looking only for people with straight PTSD. So if somebody has an additional mental illness, they're probably going to get ruled out because of what they're looking for. But in general, people, I think it's been said that people that might have something like schizophrenia or a more intense mental illness, it might not be healthy for them to go into these deeper states where they feel all of their feelings and all their emotions, just as much as it might not be healthy for them to go on a 1-month silent meditation retreat. Mm-hmm. But in terms of the actual possible risk or things just that could happen when you're on MDMA, it can increase your psychological distress. I mean, definitely things could get worse before they get better, because it enables people to go into these deeper crevices that they usually avoid at all costs. So on a physical level, it can increase your temperature. There can be a rare occurrence of chemical-driven liver damage. There can be, if there's an overdose, you can have a cerebral or a cardiovascular event, which could be fatal. It causes the release of an antidiuretic hormone. So if you drink too much water, you could have fatally low sodium, and it could cause serotonin syndrome. But if given in a controlled setting under medical supervision, the toxicity is really rare. I mean, these things tend to happen more in recreational usage, and so much can happen when you're just using it recreational, because you're not really sure if you're getting the pure, the purest form of the drug, and the set and the setting have so much to do with and your intention to use it for therapeutic use. That's not to say that somebody that goes to a festival and uses MDMA isn't going to feel better or might have some positive experience from it. It is illegal. But when you do it in this way, with this type of intense therapeutic side-by-side support, I think that's what's really giving the outcomes that we're seeing. I mean, Compass Pathways recently released data from their most recent psilocybin clinical trial, and they had some encouraging data, but they weren't as robust as the MDMA data. And what's interesting is that they did a dosing only trial. And so it was just the medication. There wasn't the therapy that went along with it.
Well, isn't it, for people in the audience who don't, I mean, Compass Pathways is a pharmaceutical company, I think UK based, correct? And they're doing trials, but aren't they tweaking the molecule a bit more so that they don't have to, because I think psilocybin, correct me if I'm wrong, but like the patent on it is basically up for grabs because Sandoz synthesized it. It might be patent free, but they're tweaking it, just kind of like with some of the sublingual or the nasal ketamine drugs. Like there's a lot of people out there. There's a lot of people, startup companies, trying to do these clinical trials to tweak the molecules a bit to make it so that they have the domain of control over it and all the cash coming to it. And Compass Pathways is one of those, correct?
Well, I know that I'm not familiar exactly with what and how they're tweaking the molecule. I do know that I think that they are trying to patent it, which means is a very debatable.
It means they'll have to change it if they're. That's like the difference between Benzedrine versus Adderall. It used to be sold as an upper. Doctors would prescribe to give you some more energy, and Hunter Thompson, if you recall him, he was a benzo. He was a speed freak before he was a everything else freak. And he swore by benzos to get his papers to the Rolling Stone, sent off, by a fax or a long time ago. But they tweaked the molecule and made it Adderall, and they sold it as an ADHD drug. So, but they had to tweak it before they could resell it. That's the trick of this. So we don't need to get bogged down on it. I'm sorry but that is kind of what we both understand it to be. But you're saying it was different and they were using it for PTSD. Was that what this trial was versus MDMA? Or it wasn't as robust for PTSD as MDMA is, or what was that?
Well, their trial was for, I believe, treatment-resistant depression. Okay. But the comparison that I was drawing was just that the MAPS trials have such an emphasis on the therapy part of it. Yeah. And the results, I think, show that. And all of that to say that I think whether it's psilocybin, whether it's MDMA, whether it's ketamine, the therapy part is just as important, if not more important, than the molecule, the medicine itself. and that psilocybin is an amazing medicine. It's amazing in a different way than MDMA and in a different way than ketamine. But I was just I noticed that if I'm understanding it correctly, they didn't have psychotherapy as part of it. It was more of a dosing only trial, which still had robust results, but not as robust as the MAPS results. Okay. And it seemed to me that maybe that had to do with the fact that there's such an emphasis on the psychotherapy part for the MDMA trials.
Oh, the context within which you're having the psychedelic experience, or the endorphin experience, or whatever it is that's going on, right? I mean,
yeah, and the intense amount of time that you take before getting to know the client, and then unpacking what happens right afterwards, and trying to, through the integration, making sense of it, bringing it into your day-to-day life, tracking the client as they make changes in their life. So.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's the difference between having a conversation with a good friend, which could be therapeutic, versus actually going to therapy and having talk therapy or somatic therapy or hypnosis or biofeedback or any number of therapies. It's different. The relationship's different. The set and the setting are certainly different, right? Your expectancies are different. So I think that's the main take home, is that these and unfortunately, maybe and the reason, I should say, maybe unfortunate that we live in a society that wants everything cheaper, better, faster, is many people are thinking, oh, cool, I'll just take LSD and all my problems will be gone. That weekend in the cabin with my friends and the mushrooms will change everything. It may well, but it may not be the same thing. So, construing them as the same is not. I mean, it is fun to do drugs. I will say that. It is fun to do drugs, and they can have an effect. And even just the first time one does psychedelics outside of a therapeutic setting can be fascinating and shift something for you inside. But it's not going to be the same. It's different. Yeah, and these are specific protocols. It sounds like the protocol is kind of similar to the one for the psilocybin protocol that's Johns Hopkins and the Hefter Institute and whatnot have been working towards, really focused therapy with the dosage, with the dosing sessions, and then the follow-up. The one thing I really took home from the APA presentation with Johns Hopkins is that the follow-up is the important, the ongoing integration of what happens in those intensive settings with the medications is really important.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there's a certain, like with ketamine, which I'm familiar with because I'm offering ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, there is this window after a client has a ketamine session, 24 to 48 hours, where it's said that the dendrites in their brain actually are able to produce new ways of looking at things. Michael Pollan, I think, said that it's kind of like if you go down a ski slope a number of times, there are grooves in the snow from your skis. But once you take one of these medications, it's just like fresh snow. And so during that time, you have the chance to actually start an exercise program. If you get maybe a message that you're too hard on yourself or that it never really was your fault, that you can actually unpack that and choose to think a different way. The thing that's interesting about these medications is that you can kind of have an idea of maybe eating less sugar is good for me. But then when you do one of these medications and your psyche wants you to know that, and the medicine provides access to the part of you that knows, and then you come out of it with this inner knowing that's integrated on a very deep level that sugar is not good for me. And if I continue to have it, I could get really sick. And then you just kind of stop eating sugar. And it happens. It's just these very kind of banal messages that we get. that are hard to explain because they just seem so simple, but it happens. And so having that therapy and the integration helps to kind of anchor those in.
24 to 48 hours. So I assume that you don't have a license to prescribe it all, but are you working in conjunction with a clinic that has a ketamine drip, or do they provide sublingual or nasal?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Yes, I work with two different organizations. I work in Woodstock with the Woodstock Therapy Center, and we have 2 licensed doctors on staff, and they do the intakes. And if the clients are approved for therapy, then they prescribe a troche, which is a kind of a dissolving lozenge that goes in your mouth, and the patient will swish it around for like maybe 15 minutes, and then they spit it out into a cup. And then for the next 30 to 40 minutes, they have an experience, and they're given an eye mask and soothing music and some blankets to feel really comfortable. And they tend to have an experience where ketamine is a disassociative. So it tends to be an experience where you're taken away from the way that you normally see yourself and your experiences in order to see them a different way. Whereas something like psilocybin, it's more of a magnifying glass going into your experience and who you are and how you see yourself. So yes, but in this situation, a doctor prescribes it. And in New York City, I work with a startup called Journey Clinical. And Journey Clinical, what they do is they have prescribers, and I refer, if I have a client that might be beneficial to ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, I refer them to Journey Clinical. And Journey Clinical, if they approve them, then they take care of the medication part, and the client is essentially using the client is prescribed the medication for at-home use. And so then I'm just acting as a psychotherapist providing psychotherapy. But the medication acts as kind of a lubricant. It kind of puts clients into a bit of a trance state in order to access feelings, emotions, and things that might not be normally available to them, and to get insights and awarenesses that can come with ketamine or any of these medications.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious. Like, I know that from my own work with people who have utilized various, like ketamine, for instance, depending on how, like I've noticed that the ketamine that I've seen, the results from ketamine have been, they don't last very long. Like, they could last after a drip, for instance, maybe about 3 to 4 weeks, and then the symptoms come back. But I'm also wondering if there's a difference between somebody with complex PTSD symptoms versus PTSD that isn't, like, from years of early developmental childhood trauma and then adolescence and so on, the kind of like repeating of the behaviors or stepping into situations where they become re-traumatized. Is that contraindicated, or is it less likely to be as helpful? In other words, somebody who might have an attachment disturbance, i.e. personality disorder or dissociative identity disorder or something like that, are those things, what does the data say about those in particular? Because the studies are specifically around people who only have PTSD, which may or may not be complex PTSD. Complex PTSD is a very much more complex kind of presentation and has its own difficulties for those people versus, say, somebody who is experiencing PTSD from the current pandemic, or from being involved in a fire or a firefight. Right. I'm wondering if there's any difference.
Well, it's a good question, and I can't really speak to that. I know that PTSD, so MDMA is what they are using in the clinical trials for PTSD. Ketamine is more known for depression, for suicidal depression, for treatment-resistant depression, for anxiety, for some PTSD. So, but I think in terms of what you were talking about, I think there needs to be more studies around that to see if it's appropriate for people with complex PTSD or how it can help. I just know that it does help some people, but I also know that MDMA is supposed to be a bit of a superior tool for PTSD. So all of these medications, they're also, because we are so different as human beings, what might work for me, what might not work for you. So it's not really a one size fits all, but there are certain illnesses that they're choosing to focus on in the clinical trials.
Yeah. Yeah. Just curious about that.
What's kind of interesting though is that, so when you get an IV, when you get ketamine through IV, they're delivering high doses via an IV as an antidepressant. So it works well as a short-acting antidepressant, but like you said, it often wears off and there's a need to go back for maintenance. So in these settings, the psychedelic side effects are considered undesirable. But ketamine-assisted psychotherapy practitioners believe that ketamine can benefit patients when admitted with psychotherapy and using those psychedelic properties to actually help. And so that's, one way that they're slightly different.
Yeah, not many people are actually doing that, right? A lot of, I think it's starting to grow, but a lot of these clinics are just a drip and not really. I've heard of experiences that people have had where they don't even have an assistant in the room,
Right. I mean, yes. I mean, a lot of the research has been done on the IV clinics. I mean, in some ways it's great that they found out that this drug can be used for suicidal thoughts and suicidal ideation. I mean, that's amazing, but there's a this, and I think that, there's also a great benefit that can happen when people can be guided or have somebody sit with them. People feel safer looking inside themselves when there's somebody there to support them and to say, it's okay to look inside your mind. And ketamine can take them to where they need to go quite quickly and strongly. Most people can't do that on their own. They need someone who's confident in the medicine and in the process. So it's like an adjunct to psychotherapy, using it to aid the process. But the dose is low enough for the patient to engage in meaningful dialogue. Whereas when you're getting it in the IV, most of the time, I think people just kind of, conk out, take a nap, and they still get an effect, but it's different.
Okay. So your what the work you're doing is different than just that, having somebody on a drip and then coming to see you, say 24 hours later. It's different than that.
Yes, the ketamine-assisted psychotherapy is different than that. But I have done integration with people who have gotten the IV infusions, and for a lot of people, it's a lifesaver. I mean, they will say they just can't even believe the life that they had before ketamine and then after ketamine in terms of their depression lifting. But yes, it is also known to kind of wear off over time. And I think there's still research to be done about how to prolong that, or, how to deal with those, duration response issues.
Yeah. Well,
but one good thing that came out a couple years ago was a nasal spray. And it's good. Well, it's both good and challenging in that the FDA has approved it for depression, which means that insurance companies will cover it. But the challenging thing is they can't regulate the dose. So with the other routes, like with IV or an intramuscular shot or the lozenges, you can vary the dosing, the frequency, the setting, whether there's a therapist there or not. But with the nasal spray, it's pretty much just a one shot. You do it in a doctor's office. And it's also incredibly expensive because ketamine is a pretty cheap drug. It costs maybe $1, but the nasal spray costs $800. So,
and which, if you think in terms of what makes more sense to you economically to run, to keep the lights on in your shop, have the person running your front desk and the scheduling, I think the IV drips are probably, they charge, what, $700 a bag or something for it, even though it costs a couple of bucks for the bag. I mean,
yes,
that is an amazing, if you have 20 people in your clinic a day, you do the math, it doesn't take much to figure out how that adds up. And I think many people are I'm not disparaging anyone, but I think many people who are anesthesiologists are making a killing off of this. Yeah.
It's true. It is true. And it's I mean, I think most of these medicines are not that expensive, but it's right. The amount of time that you have to pay the medical professionals to, to do the treatment. So even when you go in for an IV, I mean, you have to have an intake with a doctor, you have to have a prep session, you have your dosing session, and then you have to hang out there for a few hours before, you can go back into your daily life potentially without feeling woozy. So then you're kind of paying for people's time, and that's what makes them even more.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. People should be paid for their time, but it's still a huge markup on a product that costs pennies, like you were saying on the dollar.
It is, absolutely.
And the S-ketamine, I think that you were talking about, the nasal ketamine, again, it's a tweaked molecule.
Yes, I was thinking of that when you mentioned that about the other medicine.
Yeah. So,
yes, it's just a tweaked molecule.
Right. So, I mean, these are essentially, like, the outcome studies kind of point to super, like, 80%, I mean, some very large off the chart for medications even, outcomes, right? And one of the things that I've thought about, and I think I even brought up in other interviews, is the idea of the expectancy effect around the drug, the mystery around it. And of course, psilocybin and LSD and MDMA, they all have kind of their own trappings of mysteriousness, to them. Psychedelics have that. So that's a good thing in the placebo, the positive scale of things. But at the same time, expectancy effects wear off. For instance, like with SSRIs, they were doing gangbusters work with them initially. Of course, they did lie about their outcomes. I mean, they did withhold a lot of information on their outcome initially. So they're really not all that effective, and the FDA probably shouldn't approve them. But we won't bring that up. The regression to the mean of just kind of a 50-50 chance of something working. So I'm wondering, I'm very excited about these therapies. I can see it shifting mental health in a lot of ways and helping people, as long as it's rolled out in a very humane and working on the side of the clinic, on the side of the public's health and better health, and from a clinical perspective, from a healer's perspective.
Yes, it's going to be a very interesting challenge to roll them out, because there's going to be a lot of demand and a lot of therapists that need to be trained. And it's a type of treatment that requires a heavy investment of both money and time up front, whereas our regular, our modality of psychiatry now is pretty much to give people a medication that, maybe isn't cheap, but isn't incredibly expensive, and they take it every day for years, if not for the rest of their life. And so this is it's a different type of treatment that requires a monetary investment and a time investment intensely up front, with hopefully a payoff, which is not having to go to the doctor for this medicine at all again.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, and will insurance companies cover it? When will they start to cover it? I mean, it's to their benefit to do so if it heals employees and, or heals people that they're trying to cover, versus the ongoing treatment for years and years. But I think it'll take a while for people to warm up to it, to adjust to it. I think the biggest thing is that even though there's so much in the news these days about them and about the positive possibilities and results, people are scared. I mean, a lot of us grew up in the just say no to drugs. I mean, myself, I grew up thinking all drugs were bad. Heroin was the same as LSD, which was the same as cocaine, and they were all just horrible and stay away. And thinking that if you did LSD, you were going to jump out a window, or if you took MDMA, you were going to have your spinal fluid, drained from you. So
I bought that one about MDMA. I did buy that because I didn't my due diligence was not up and running at the time. I did not buy that about LSD or psilocybin or marijuana or a host of other things. But I know what you mean. I lived in that era where it was just like scare the hell out of people, especially our parents.
Yes, exactly. Especially our parents.
Especially our parents. That'll get us. That got us. But
if they become approved, it'll take away some of the danger of using them, right? Because they'll be FDA approved. It'll improve access. But we need education. We need people that have done these medications to come forward, and people need to firsthand stories by those who've been helped. That's really helpful for moving both politicians and people that are interested to try.
But that seems to be like people are excited about these medications. I think, as an interview with Dr. Greer a couple of years ago, he said that a lot of conservative people are looking at how this could help veterans. I mean, this could really help veterans. I mean,
oh my goodness.
I mean, if you worked in the VA, or if you're alive and if you worked in clinical settings, you rushed up against what happens with veterans. They are basically ground up and spat out. I mean, whether or not they saw action or not. I mean, they're treated like cannon fodder, even more so here than they are when they're wearing fatigues,
Absolutely. I mean, in fact, I think some of the veterans are actually doing a lot of the work to push this forward. Yeah. I was reading that there's a lot of demand in Texas, especially after the withdrawal from Afghanistan, because antidepressants can cause for some people more mania or increased suicide ideation. Yeah. And then they're put on an antipsychotic, and then they need Viagra for the sexual side effects of PTSD, which then causes sleep issues. And so there are, there's a guy named Jesse Gould, and he founded something called the Heroic Hearts Project, which advocates the use of psychedelic treatment for vets. And due to one a vet in Texas experience with 5-MeO-DMT, which is a hallucinogenic toad venom, that Texas just became the first state to fund a psychedelic medicine trial, which is psilocybin to ease PTSD. It even has the support of the conservative former governor Rick Perry, because one of his friends did ibogaine at a Mexican clinic for U.S. veterans, which is another psychedelic that's used to help get people off of opiates. Yeah. So there's a number of nonprofits, one called Warrior Angels Foundation, which helps veterans access psychedelics. Another one called Veterans Exploring Treatment Solutions. So they're on it. I mean, they are understandably sick and tired of trying tons and tons of different things and not having them work. And then having a few of them try some of these medications and having their life back is really causing a stir and causing a lot of people to get involved.
And yes, so I think the chance that Richard Nixon rears his ugly head from the grave and declares Timothy Leary and everyone else and you and everyone else and the women's knitting clatch or whatever, coffee clatch down the street, enemy of the state. I don't think that's going to happen. Thank goodness. I think that and we're so desperate for really good treatments. But again, hopefully we can keep the therapeutic focus on this and the talk therapy part of it. Which I think we will, with people like you out there doing your good work, and others, and MAPS and Usonia and Johns Hopkins and Hefter folks. And yeah, I think that's wonderful. And you did mention, I wanted to swing back real quickly. You said you consider yourself a spiritual therapist, spiritually oriented therapist. Does that mean you were trained transpersonally, or did you just kind of mosey into that over the years? It made sense to you?
Yeah, well, I went to a university in California called the University of Santa Monica, and they offered 2 degrees. One is a master's in spiritual psychology, and one was a master's in counseling psychology. And so the master's in counseling psychology was the thing that enabled me to get licensed as a marriage and family therapist. But they have a very interesting curriculum. It's an experiential program. It's run by a husband and wife team, Ron and Mary Hulnick. And basically they combine a lot of therapies like Carl Rogers, person-centered therapy, Gestalt, psychosynthesis, inner child work, parts work, compassionate self-forgiveness work. And what happens in their program is that you learn about a concept, and then you immediately break into a small group of 3 people. One's a client, one's a counselor, and one's a neutral observer. And so you bring up your own material and learn how to use these tools to work with other people.
Wow.
And so it was an amazing program. I think it was one of the best things that I've ever done in my life. And there was just a 360 from who I was when I went in to who I was when I came out. I mean, prior to that, I'd been living in New York City, working in corporate. Being a therapist is actually a second career for me. I spent 14 years working in luxury goods in New York City, living a very different kind of Sex and the City lifestyle of working all day, going to parties, putting way too much emphasis on fancy clothes and fancy parties and drinking. But at the same time, always had some interest in things spiritual. I would be reading Gary Zukav's books on the weekend, and on my vacations, I'd go out to Arizona and do a retreat with a doctor named Brew Joy, who did retreats in the desert where you did Jungian dream analysis and energy work and things like that. So it was only kind of
recharge yourself a little bit, and then go back.
Yeah, so it was kind of kismet that I found this place, USM. I just met a woman in New York one day who had this very calm demeanor, and I was like, "Well, how did you get that? I want that," because I did not know people in New York City that were that calm. And she told me about USM, and I was going maybe 6 months later. So that kind of, I'd already had it in me. I was very interested in spiritual growth and healing, but USM was the vehicle that helped me now take it out into the world and first work my own process around my own unhealed stuff, because you can't take somebody any place that you haven't been yourself. So that was my entryway into that. And then a number of years after that, I discovered psychedelics through basically through my interest in Gabor Mate's work. I became interested in his work in trauma, and would listen to him whenever he'd come to New York City. And I just love that he's worked so hard to normalize addiction and normalize and humanize like why addicts use, and that he feels that every addict has trauma, but not every person that has trauma becomes an addict.
Correct.
And that trauma isn't what happens to you, it's what happens inside of you and who's there to go through it with you. So he, when I would see him speak, every once in a while, he started to drop the word ayahuasca into what he was doing, what he believed was helpful. And so I Googled it, and then I was like, oh, wow, this is a drug. And it's actually somebody I respect talking about it in a positive way. So let me look more into this. And then I took a intro to psychedelics 101, 102 for clinicians. And then it was kind of ignited from there.
Yeah. When was it you went to MAPS for the certification program, if that's what you got? Was Alan Wolfson who runs that, correct? Or primarily is Wolfson the guy involved with that?
Well, I don't know if that's one of the main people that run it. That's not somebody that I'm familiar with. I just finished the program in December. Okay. And I think I think maybe the 5th or 6th cohort of therapists that they've trained.
I have looked into that for my own edification.
It was great. I highly recommend it. Since COVID, they actually put it online, which has made it available to a lot more people. Mm-hmm. There were actually 500 therapists in my cohort, which was both a plus and a minus. I mean, it was a plus in that they got so many therapists are trained, and therapists from Senegal and all over the world could attend. The minus was just that it was just missing that personal component, but I was lucky enough that there were a number of them in New York City, and so we continue to hang out and network together. But yes, I just finished that in December. But I think since each training is slightly different, they probably have different people that come in as guests or facilitate it or act as leaders. So
okay. Just thought I'd check. Well, what's on the agenda for you? You were, before COVID hit, you mentioned to me earlier, you were doing, and I mentioned in the intro to you, you were doing talks for people. And it sounds like you backed off from doing that because of COVID, because of being able to safely talk to people on a stage and maybe not wear a mask. Have you thought about moving it on to the web somewhere, starting web seminars or finding a platform for that, or are we, as we all are, ready to hit the ground running and do that again after COVID is gone?
Yes, it's in the works. I think that one of the great things about having webinars is that more and more people can access it. And I think it's very important for therapists especially to understand what these medications are and what they can do and who they might refer and all of that. So I am planning to do some webinars both online and then in person when we open up again, as well as during COVID, I took some writing classes and have started to publish some articles. And so I hope to continue to get the word out that way as well. Yeah,
I saw that you sent me the article from Insider. I'll make sure that that's posted in the show notes for everybody to take a look at, an article on psychedelic-assisted therapies. How can people reach you? People will want to talk to you after they hear this amazing talk, I know.
Oh, great. Well, my website, RebeccaHendrix.com. On Instagram, Rebecca Hendrix LMFT. So those are pretty much the best ways to get me.
You split time between, are you practicing? Do you have an office in Woodstock and in Manhattan, or just in Manhattan?
Both. In Woodstock, I have an office and work with a ketamine team at the Woodstock Therapy Center. Oh, okay. And in Manhattan, I have a private office on 24th and Park. Awesome.
So, send me any links you wish to attach to the show notes, Rebecca Hendrix. Really wonderful having you on the show. I really enjoyed our conversation here, and I'm excited about these new innovations in therapy and healing.
I did as well. Thank you so much for having me. It's been great.
You're welcome. Take care.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Psychology Talk podcast. This podcast is intended for informative and entertainment purposes only. If you need a mental health professional, please seek one out. All material, copyright, the Psychology Talk podcast. Music is provided by the oddly Italianate named band Serenati. Ciao.